Carter Roberts was just 3 when he was hit by sudden paralysis that looked just like polio.
Carter probably developed the flu-like symptoms on a Saturday morning, and then within 24 hours, he was unable to move.
Doctors theorized it could be a rare polio-like virus that had also suddenly emerged at the same time, enterovirus, or EVD68.
What's the difference between what we're seeing with these children and polio?
Not much, which is interesting.
From a hilltop just outside of town, and in Beaumont looks like your average blue-collar village. But this French faction of the country's Rust Belt has faced more than its fair share of struggles. After years of struggle, the town is now rebounding. The success, some say, rests upon a controversial new notion. This has been dubbed a town without immigrants.
Should people be allowed to wear burqas? Should they be allowed to wear yarmulkes in public?
I don't think, because we should only see what gathers us, not what divides us.
It's been a long time since a bill like this has been signed, reaffirming our national commitment to the core mission of NASA.
President Trump has set his sights on Mars.
Where are we today when it comes to space exploration?
I think we're actually at a threshold. We're really on, I think, the threshold of understanding whether or not there's life anywhere in our solar system besides here on the Earth.
Welcome to Full Measure. I'm Sharyl Attkisson. A year and a half ago, we first reported on a baffling new illness responsible for nightmarish scenarios. A child wakes up and his legs don't move. Soon, he's paralyzed from the neck down. Since then, the number of cases has grown, yet the Centers for Disease Control says it still has no clue what's causing it and won't say much else. One thing we know, the disease mimics one of the world's most feared illnesses, polio. Today, we continue our investigation into the mysterious outbreak that's left hundreds of American children suddenly frozen.
Carter probably developed the flu-like symptoms on a Saturday morning, and then within 24 hours of that, by then Sunday morning, we found him on the floor and no mobility in his right side. He was unable to move, and he was faintly asking for help.
Carter Roberts was just 3 when he was hit by sudden paralysis that looked just like polio. We first caught up with his father, Chris, last year at Kennedy Krieger Institute in Baltimore, Maryland, where Carter was hospitalized for months.
Last night, he cried for about 25 minutes, just uncontrollably. He's in, I think, regular and constant pain. Although he is immobile, he can definitely feel everything all over his body.
As more cases piled up in fall of 2014, CDC gave the mysterious paralysis a new name, acute flaccid myelitis, or AFM, inflammation of the spinal cord. Mandy Baker was an honor student about to start her sophomore year of high school and went from feeling fine to being paralyzed in a single day. Her illness ran up a $3 million hospital bill for treatments not covered by insurance.
You can do it. Say, there you go.
But what was causing the sudden paralysis? Doctors theorized it could be a rare polio-like virus that had also suddenly emerged at the same time, enterovirus, or EVD68. Unusually high numbers of kids were showing up at ERs with severe breathing problems from EVD68. 4-year-old Eli Waller of Hamilton, New Jersey, died after coming down with EVD68. So did Madeline Reed, a toddler in Detroit, and 10-year-old Emily Otrando of Rhode Island. Was the same virus that sickened and killed some children, paralyzing others. In 5 months, there were more than 1,000 severe cases of EVD68, at least 14 deaths, and 120 known cases of AFM paralysis, mostly young children. The CDC, normally quick to raise alarms and speak on TV when there's any threat of infectious disease, wasn't saying much at all this time. They declined our repeated interview requests and instead pointed me to this video that it provided WebMD.
Infants, children, and teenagers are most likely to get infected with enteroviruses and become ill.
The video offered little insight. I requested more information under the Freedom of Information Act. It took CDC more than a year and a half to begin turning over documents. Internal emails show CDC trying to figure out what was triggering paralysis in some of the kids who had the EVD68 virus. Was it exposure to West Nile virus, insecticides, international travel, or vaccines, particularly oral polio vaccine? Officials say they still can't pinpoint the origin. One physician who treated dozens of the paralyzed children seemed to be looking at the bigger picture, Dr. Benjamin Greenberg. In emails, Dr. Greenberg wondered if we were seeing the 21st century version of polio. If it is in the early stages of evolution, he urged CDC, we can get ahead of it. I recently tracked down Dr. Greenberg of Children's Health in Dallas and UT Southwestern Medical Center.
What's the difference between what we're seeing with these children and polio?
Not much, which is interesting.
Greenberg filled in a lot of blanks on the mysterious afflictions where CDC would not.
Is it accurate to say this is less contagious than polio?
We don't know yet. Part of what we're lacking is the ability to go through a population and determine who has been exposed to this virus and who hasn't. We looked at the papers written 100 years ago describing cases of poliomyelitis in the U.S., and we talked to colleagues from around the world who are actually part of teams who treat polio cases. And to all of our surprises, basically what we were seeing was a polio-like illness, but not from the polio virus.
Millions of people have been infected with this EVD68, but a relatively few actually come down with the paralysis. Do we have any idea why those certain children get paralyzed?
We don't know that yet, but it's worth noting that that phenomenon, that the same virus can infect thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even millions of people with only a few individuals having catastrophic events from the virus, is true for almost every virus in human biology.
At its worst, polio killed 3,000 and paralyzed 21,000 Americans in a single year back in 1952. In 2014, there were 120 known cases of AFM paralysis in the U.S. In 2015, there were just 21. But last year, the number surged to 138. There have been 5 confirmed cases so far this year.
Did polio have a pathology that was anything similar to what you're seeing now?
So if we look at the history of polio, at least in the United States, it started with small outbreaks and then would disappear for years and then reemerge.
The question is whether AFM paralysis is following a similar pattern of surfacing, receding, and surfacing again in a bigger way.
Clearly, it's not a one-time event.
Clearly, as we saw in this last year, we had a spike in cases again. And so we know that this virus has the capability, if it is the cause, to come back and to cause damage.
With CDC saying so little publicly, families struck by the horrible illness, like Mackenzie Anderson of Albany, Oregon, have found each other on Facebook. Mackenzie went from having a cold to being paralyzed from the neck down and on a ventilator in 12 days. CDC is firmly refusing to disclose how many cases are in which states, even though that information is public in nature. CDC told me it has not received any reports of death from AFM paralysis, but with the health agency so tight-lipped about these cases, some families wonder if the numbers are underreported. The family of 14-year-old Isaac Prestridge of Louisiana says CDC originally said AFM caused their son's death. He got sick last October, complaining of a weird feeling in his knees, and died 2 days later. But when Isaac's case didn't show up in CDC reports on AFM deaths, the family asked why. They say the CDC then told him it had reopened Isaac's case and eventually attributed his death to a different form of paralysis. Carter's family says CDC won't count his case either in their published statistics, despite Carter's doctors describing it as characteristically AFM.
Some of these kids die.
They do. It is a very rare event to have death related to acute flaccid myelitis. Unfortunately, it has happened.
Although the 1-2 punch of EVD68 and AFM paralysis has been more damaging over the past 3.5 years than much more publicized diseases, it's still in the shadows.
More kids have been hurt seriously with this than measles, Ebola, and Zika combined. But you don't hear anything about it.
So there are some scientific reasons to have priorities around Ebola, measles, and Zika that are very valid. Enterovirus D68 is a common virus with a low rate of causing significant paralysis or conditions that lead to disability. And so the decisions have been made that while it is a problem, while it is a concern, it may not garner the level of need that some other public health issues do.
Do you agree with that?
I wish we had the resources to do it all.
Greenberg says there's reason to hope that AFM isn't the beginning of another polio-like epidemic. So far, he says, the rate of paralysis after infection seems lower than it was with polio.
The number one question we get asked is about rehabilitation and recovery. Will children get better after the event?
And what's the answer?
They do. It's very slow, and it takes a lot of work. When we stay aggressive and we push and we stay with a routine, we're seeing slowly but surely improvements occur.
Today, Carter is out of the hospital and back at home in Richmond, Virginia. There's been no improvement in his condition, but he's considered stable.
From what I've seen, what I've read, from what I've heard, there's only been 2 children who've recovered fully. It's very hard from day to day. We are day to day, almost hour to hour.
Believe it or not, AFM paralysis isn't a reportable disease like West Nile virus or measles, meaning doctors aren't required to report cases. Dr. Greenberg thinks that should change. In fact, he advocates a broadened surveillance system to track all kinds of sudden paralysis to better find answers as to what's causing them. Ahead on Full Measure, Scott Thuman takes us to a small town in France. It's a town without immigrants. Immigration was a pivotal issue driving the U.S. presidential race. Now for President Trump, it's time to go from promises to policy. Do we build the wall? Expel all illegal immigrants? Those same issues were part of the recent French presidential election. When Scott Thuman was there covering the big race, he found a small town taking policy into its own hands.
From a hilltop just outside of town, and in Beaumont looks like your average blue-collar village. But this French faction of the country's Rust Belt has faced more than its fair share of struggles. People's optimism had been replaced with piles of slag from closed-up coal mines.
People are jaded from all these promises that haven't been fulfilled. There was a catastrophic deficit here. We were paying exorbitant taxes.
The language is different. The scene and complaints, the same as you'd find in coal country Pennsylvania.
My father was in the coal mine, and that's the way I supported my family.
Or cattle country in Texas.
I want to get the trade between the countries fixed.
In all, economies tanked, jobs dried up, and so did people's hope. Christopher Zurek is the deputy mayor of Beaumont.
As you can tell, it's quite poor, a huge unemployment rate. And
how big is the unemployment rate here?
20%.
20%.
After years of struggle, the town is now rebounding, sprucing up, building. The success, some say, rests upon a controversial new notion. This has been dubbed a town without immigrants.
Should people be allowed to wear burqas? Should they be allowed to wear yarmulkes in public?
I don't think, because we have a strong belief in secularism. In public life, we should only see what gathers us, not what divides us.
Last year, the town rallied support to form the Town Without Immigrants Association, a stand against taking in any refugees from Europe's overwhelming migrant crisis, as the country's massive jungle refugee camp once sat just an hour away. The winds of change arrived via a political push that mirrors, to some degree, what's happened in Middle America towns across the United States, where people chose populism and protectionism in hopes of reviving the economy.
It's got to start somewhere. The taxpayers, the blue collar, the working people cannot continue to support 2/3 of the world.
Calls for figurative walls in Beaumont have come from the National Front Party, which now dominates the region.
It was a time where France got a lot of work to give, as it's not the case anymore. We denounce immigration now, but we don't denounce the people, we denounce the politics.
And not just about jobs. France has fundamentally changed since the attacks. There, Friday, November 13th. Daniel Vaissier is a retired craftsman.
Those who don't want to integrate, we keep out, and that's it. Look at what happened in Paris. A Friday evening, people were just sitting with friends on the patio or at the Bataclan Theatre, and they were shot. No, that's not acceptable. Something must be done.
The reality of terrorism created a fertile ground for divisive politics, and human rights activist Marine Tondelier says anyone opposing the immigrant-free platform found life here untenable.
Everyone knows that immigrants are not welcome here?
Yes. If you want to come to France and you're immigrants, you don't go to Front National City.
An irony considering the town's origin.
It has no sense here to say this because we were calling people from the abroad to make the coal mines work. So it's not
in a town that was built on immigrants.
Yes.
It's difficult
and by immigrants.
And by immigrants in the coal mines here. You're saying it's difficult then to suddenly say, we don't need them, we don't want them, they're not welcome.
Yes.
While the National Front lost the national election, they are hardly giving up. And just as Ebola survived Roman and Norman invasions over the centuries, change happens.
Maybe in 10 years we won't be still being seen as devil, you know.
Seen as the devil.
That's it.
So the theory is without immigrants there are more jobs for the locals and that's more prosperous for them?
Well, on the one hand, when you have a 20% unemployment rate, there would be fewer people competing for a handful of jobs. However, on the flip side, we also saw a lot of shuttered storefronts, and if those immigrants were welcomed, they would be consumers. Perhaps they'd keep some of those businesses afloat.
Fascinating. Thanks a lot, Scott. And coming up on Full Measure, it was once an American initiative. Now it's a mandate to put a man on Mars. Space, the final frontier, might also prove to be at least one unifier in Congress. Both Republicans and Democrats passed a budget pledging $19.6 billion to NASA. Part of that budget comes with a directive from President Trump to put Americans back in space. Lisa Fletcher has more.
How likely is it that we're going to get to Mars?
Oh, we're going to get to Mars. I think it's really a matter of having the right tools to carry humans and the desire to back that up.
John Grant is one of the foremost experts on Mars. A geologist by training, Grant is one of the operators of the 2 rovers currently on the Red Planet. Opportunity, which landed in 2004, and Curiosity, there since 2012. Where are we today when it comes to space exploration?
I think we're actually at a threshold. We're really on, I think, the threshold of understanding whether or not there's life anywhere in our solar system besides here on the Earth.
It's that desire that fueled the space aspirations of the nation in 1961, when President John F. Kennedy told America it would lead in the world by leading in space.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
More than half a century later, President Trump has set his sights on Mars.
It's been a long time since a bill like this has been signed, reaffirming our national commitment to the core mission of NASA.
As he made clear on a recent call with 2 American astronauts at the International Space Station.
What do you see a timing for actually sending humans to Mars?
Well, I think as your bill directed, it'll be approximately in the 2030s.
Well, we want to try and do it during my first term or at worst during my second term, so we'll have to speed that up a little bit, okay?
We'll do our best.
Scientists say realistically, 2033 is the target date for a human mission to Mars. Let's say we dedicated all of the resources necessary to put a human on Mars in the next 10 years. What do we get out of that?
Well, I think you get something very fundamental about humans leaving the home planet. Here we're no longer bound to one single planet around a star. We're starting to kind of branch out and explore and become an interplanetary species. I think that in and of itself says something about humans sort of making a step beyond where we are right now.
And liftoff of the Falcon 9 to the space station.
But as NASA certifies new space vehicles and manned flights to the Moon and Mars are being planned, the Challenger and Columbia tragedies still loom large. Those catastrophic events drove NASA to set a new safety benchmark of roughly 1 fatal accident per 700 flights. But the rush back to space may take on higher risk. A report in the Wall Street Journal states NASA has offered design guidance to the private companies designing the capsule to carry astronauts back to the moon, that the risk of fatality should be no more than 1 in 240 flights. The reality is that manned flight is dangerous. For American astronauts, the risk of a catastrophic failure is still 1 in 9.
Obviously, the idea of space travel captures the American imagination. It's part of our identity, but it also costs billions of dollars. Is that something that the U.S. can afford?
I think everybody has to answer that question themselves. I think, based on the folks that I've talked with, that a lot of people share that intrigue in exploration, the excitement of discovery. It's something that has moved our culture forward for many, many years.
But the years between now and astronauts on Mars is set. Congress directed NASA to get humans near or on the surface in the 2030s. Lisa Fletcher for Full Measure.
And next on Full Measure, a U.S. missile test to check the threat of a North Korean attack. We check on the program that's had its share of failures. North Korea's ongoing missile tests and ever-growing threat to target the U.S. with nuclear weapons prompted the latest Pentagon test to shoot down incoming missiles. The launch was from California's Vandenberg Air Force Base to intercept a simulated missile threat launched from the Pacific Marshall Islands. It was successful. But there are a few reasons to question the reliability of the safety net. Since 2004, the interceptors have failed to hit and destroy target warheads in 6 out of 10 flight tests. Coming up next week on Full Measure, MRIs are a powerful tool used to diagnose and track disease, but there's concern that the contrast dyes sometimes used may be deadly for some. Chuck Norris and his wife had to confront an opponent he couldn't fight. She says when she came out of the room in the hospital, you took one look at her. What did you see?
Well, I saw death in her eyes. I saw her dying. And I said, you know, I've got to do something. I can take her anywhere in the world. I'm blessed enough to have the money to do that. But where do I take her?
Critical concerns about repeated tests that may do more harm than good on the next Full Measure. Until then, we'll be searching for more stories that hold powers accountable.